right, well, welcome everyone to our first session of today's symposium, which will look at economic security, the next transatlantic challenge. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Peter Raschers, the Vice President and Director of the Geoeconomics Program at the American-German Institute in Washington. In this session, we will examine the impact of the Trump administration's positioning on international economic policy, as well as the new Merz government's determination to bring about a more economically dynamic and more strategically focused Germany, and then more broadly, the ambition we're beginning to see during the second von der Leyen Commission to strengthen the EU's competitiveness and deepen its integration across a number of sectors, which could lead it to being able to exert a more effective international role at a time when the economic order continues to be disrupted. And that disruption includes a questioning or a weakening of established trade rules, trade agreements, and institutions at the multilateral and levels below that, and difficulties that the United States, and I think more recently, also Germany and the EU, are having in facing big questions that face their economy, like China's subsidized manufacturing, overcapacity, but also something we'll address in the second session, the rise of digital technologies, digital services, and trade, and the perception that has, I think, been around in the United States for a few years, but I think is also emerging on this side of the Atlantic, which is that trade policies need to play a stronger role in promoting not just broad-based prosperity, but also national security. And just to contextualize a bit things, looking at it from a European point of view, the European Union just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community, which was its kind of founding action to try to bring peace in Europe by combining the coal and steel economies of France and Germany and the other four who took part. And I think that while history doesn't repeat itself, my sense is that on this side of the Atlantic, there's a lot of looking back at actions like that to see if they can inspire a kind of move forward in Brussels and in capitals to be able to face this more unsteady, disorderly global economy that we have now. So just quickly on the housekeeping, we'll start out with some opening questions and statements from the panelists. Then I will engage them in conversation, and I hope that all of you will not be shy about sharing your questions so we can continue the conversation that way. I know you have the bios, so let me just very briefly introduce today's panelists. Let me start at that end. Andres Nicolin is Deputy Director General, I think, of the newly renamed Ministry, Director General for Economic Security at the newly renamed Ministry of Federal Economic Affairs and Energy, if I've got that correctly. Laura von Daniels is head of the Research Division, the Americas, at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, or in English, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. David Metzner is managing partner at ACG Analytics in Washington, which is an analytical consulting firm. And finally, Lisandro Flach is director of the IFO Center for International Economics and professor of economics at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, both here in Munich. So welcome all of you. Andreas, let's start with you. We'll be balanced here. I'm on one end, you're on the other end. And we also have a new government, so I think all of us are waiting to hear perhaps what that heralds. You've been, as we were discussing before, not only your current position, but even before, you've been working on economic security issues within the German government for a few years now. How much do you see that issue of economic security being a driver of Germany's economic and trade policy today compared to the more traditional ideas or goals like free trade and maintaining or building a rules-based global economy?
Okay, does it work? The micro, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Very happy to be here, and also very happy to see you again after a couple of years. I mean, it's clear that Germany has always been one of the strongest supporters of free trade and a rules-based economy. We have been very active in promoting the WTO, but also bilateral trade agreements like TTIP a couple of years ago. We talked at that before bilaterally, but also CETA, which was successful after all, trade agreements with Japan, and now EU-Mercosur is another one which is in the pipeline and very of strategic importance. This support is of course quite natural given the trade orientation of the German economy, and this trade-oriented German economic model has been under political pressure for many years because we always had this big current account surpluses, and it was the Americans, it was from within Europe that we got big critique and appeals to reduce this surplus. But only with the recent crisis of the COVID pandemic and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it became evident that our economy is quite vulnerable with respect to external shocks. And this impression got even stronger with the change of China's industrial strategy, which has been mentioned before, and also its behavior as a global actor, which is of course also quite doubtful. Very recently, the disruptions in transatlantic cooperation focused also on security issues and trade relations, as already has been mentioned in the introduction. Our main feeling was that because of all these massive changes in the world, our free trade policy has to be adjusted, at least, to incorporate geopolitical and other risks in a more systematic manner. So back in 2022, the first step was to study the Japanese approach on economic security and its institutional and operational implications, which was quite interesting. And our preliminary conclusion was that, in particular, with regard to supply chains and with regard to technologies, we have to look more closely at economic security risks. I think the differentiation between supply chains and technology is important because supply chains is the easier part, even if it's the more popular issue. So there are many conferences on economic security which deal exclusively with supply chain questions. But on supply chains, there are strong incentives for business companies to manage their risks and to adjust supply chains in accordance with those risks, and it's not so easy to spot any difference between those private incentives and issues of public security. So this leads, for example, to diversification concepts like China plus one, which is a very popular one in the business community. But there are, of course, certain sensitive parts of supply chains where indeed business incentives seem to be not sufficient because of any kind of market failure, for example, with respect to raw materials or other critical items as, for example, semiconductors. On technologies, the issues of public security are more subtle. But there are, behind the scenes, there are quite heavy discussions about critical cutting-edge technologies like quantum, artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, and so on. And in these areas, we are closer to the issue of public security in a more traditional sense, but and we have some traditional instruments in place, for example, export control and investment screening. it is, of course, the government's task to guarantee that those technologies do not come under the control, let's say, of regimes in certain countries of concern. And this is particularly important since the new trend of global rivalries, it seems that those rivalries are carried out to considerable degree in the area of those very technologies. Therefore, actually, we have taken several operational measures in the area of economic security. The first one was to set up a unit in our ministry, which also is in charge of coordinating interministerial activities. And now it will be quite interesting to see how this will interplay with the new National Security Council in the Federal Chancellery, which is to be set up. Second point, in the last government period or legislative period, we have drafted and various strategies, which also have been endorsed by political leaders. For example, national security strategy, China strategy, also a strategy on raw materials, and one on industrial policy. And the common issue of all those strategies is, starting from different angles, is to aim to reduce risks and strengthen resilience of production capabilities. Third point, in accordance with the new European Union economic security strategy of 2023, existing instruments like investment screening and export control, which I mentioned before, are being adjusted, and new mechanisms are in discussion, for example, on outbound investment control, and also in the area of research security, which is also quite sensitive in this regard. Fourth point, international cooperation has been strengthened. For example, on the G7 level, starting with the Japanese presidency, but also actually the Canadian presidency has set up a particular senior officials mechanism on economic security. And there have been ad hoc fora, for example, several workshops by like-minded governments on critical technologies, which has been still an initiative of the Biden administration in last year. And it looks as if that is also going to be continued. Fifth point, talks and exchanges with our business community on economic security have been set up to identify strands of cooperation, since economic security is, of course, a common interest of government and business. And there are, of course, some tricky issues to tackle with, for example, passing of sensitive sharing of sensitive business information and so on. And sixth and last point, the coalition of the new government, the coalition treaty of the new government contains a commitment to continue work on economic security and even to work on a national economic security strategy that aligns itself with the existing European strategy. All in all, we are, of course, sticking to the overarching economic model of free trade, international division of labor, and the rules-based economy, but as I said it before, we want to adjust it in the most suitable manner by addressing economic security risks. And in doing so, this is a particularly important point for the new government. We want to, and also for my minister, we want to avoid any red tape for business as much as we can. And finally, it's of course important to note that the strengthening of traditional trade policy, for example, by finalizing new free trade agreements on the EU level, is in itself would in itself be a very important step forward to increase economic security. So I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. And thank you also it was interesting you mentioned Japan. They, of course, made economic security a big focus of their G7 presidency, and in general, it's interesting to continue to watch how they handle the situation given their geographical location, among other things. David, if I could turn to you for a U.S. view, maybe on Germany and how you see Germany's change of course that has been mentioned on the debt brake, on domestic investment, on defense policy. How do you think all of those things could impact the U.S. administration's approach to its relationship with Germany?
Well, Peter, thank you very much for having me here. I'm David Metzner. You might be able to tell by my last name that I have some German connections, but it actually goes deeper than that. I'm verheiratet mit der deutsche Frau, who my children speak German to their mother, and French to their teachers, and English to their father. So we have a lot of, my house is very much a transatlantic house in Washington, D.C., and it's great to be back in Bavaria and Munich and Germany, a country that I consider a second home. I'd like to preface it by saying that if you look at the U.S. GDP and compare it to the EU's GDP, Germany's GDP, the U.S. is like this, okay? And it's been a sustained growth for a long time, okay? It's this sustained growth because there is a over 400 million people market, right? It has a capital, lots of non-banked capital. It has securitized debt. It has insolvency laws that work. It has courts, rule of law that works. But behind all that economic strength, there's economic weakness, okay? The U.S. runs a $2 trillion structural deficit every year. That's basically unsustainable. And people now know it. It's a topic of conversation in the United States. We run a $450 billion trade deficit with China, a $230 billion trade deficit with Europe. Of that, 70 billion is Germany, and 50 billion is Ireland, a country of 3 million people. So as I get into answer your question, I mean, Trump looks at the world two ways. One is he looks at the world as very much a post-war American child, right? He looks at the world as an industrial, an industrial world, particularly one that manufactures automobiles. So his tariffs are really focused more than anything on reshoring auto manufacturing and auto parts. Of all the autos sold in America, half are not made there, and half the parts that go into the cars are not made there. The second issue that Trump is focused on is COVID-related supply chains. Okay, so pharma is one of his focuses. Okay, we had a lot of problems with I talked to the former U.S. ambassador to China, Stapleton Roy. He said when he was ambassador, there was no Food and Drug Administration inspectors, at the embassy. Now they're like 50. And so those are the sort of what the challenge is and what Trump's trying to do. One of my concerns coming here often is that we don't have enough communication between both sides, and that's why the work of amerikahaus is so important. I remember the day after Election Day, a friend of mine in Frankfurt called me up and said, I can't believe the FAZ got it wrong again. We were told that Kamala Harris was going to win. And of course, on our side of the Atlantic, we had a 65% chance in our firm that Trump was going to win. It seemed like impossible for her to win. So getting better communication, understanding our zeitgeist better, understanding some of why these things are happening are very important. Moving to German-American relations, certainly getting to 2% of GDP spending is important. I think Germany's going to be 2.1, 2.2, somewhere around. But it took a long time, all right? And as Secretary Bessent said at Mike Milken's conference in LA last week, he said when Trump's first term, 25% of Europe spent 2% of GDP. All right, today 75% does. And of course, Poland spends 4%, I think Britain is going to 2.5. So it's an important benchmark, okay? I don't think it's the only benchmark. Of course, the Bundeswehr had 495,000 people in it during the Cold War, and today it has 65,000, okay? So, I think, and I think there's I think that, so it's a challenge, that's one step in the right direction. I think, I think that better communication, more exchanges. I think the private sector has a huge role, because I think, good relations are built on the private sector, government work, private sector work, student exchanges. I mean, the world, the biggest thing that's changed in my life is when I first came to Europe, you got on the 747, it was like a big deal. Now there's a plane every 30 kilometers over the North Atlantic. So what we really need to do is not be afraid. We have to be, we talk about, all the German companies in the United States, the American companies in Bavaria and in Germany. But I'm not a believer, for instance, in capitalism with Chinese characteristics, okay? I'm a believer in capitalism with Western democracy characteristics. And that means rule of law, okay? That means protection of IP. And I think what we have to do is, we have to stop apologizing about the values of the North Atlantic relationship, right? We have to say, you know what? Democracy's better than autocracy, right? Capitalism with judges you trust is better than party officials. And we have to stand up for those values. That's what brought us prosperity in the post-war era. And I think we're there again. And I think, crossing the defense issue off the list of things that need to be done, and watching how over the next couple of years, it's going to be a big challenge for Germany to absorb that. I mean, does it have the industrial base, really, to rearm and rebuild? I mean, it's a question. Does Europe have that? So it's going to be time to tell. But I think we all can work harder by communicating better, all right, and standing up for the values that have made our economies and our societies unique in the world, and not have to say we're sorry about it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, David, about that. It's a reminder of the importance of communication, information flows, which sounds like it just has to be an ongoing and even stepped up effort on all of our sides. So thank you all for being here to be part of that. Lisandro, let me turn to you now and ask you if you could, from a German point of view, tell us a little bit about where you see the government's commitments in economic policy and trade policy, and what that means for transatlantic relations.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So yeah, first of all, by putting defense and infrastructure at the center of the agenda, Germany is simply responding to the very turbulent geopolitical and economic landscape that we are facing. I think we all know that we are witnessing really major transformations in the geopolitical and economic landscape, in which now geopolitical considerations are increasingly dictating trade policy and protectionism. So if we look at the data, protectionism is not new, and the fact that protectionism has gained in importance, we see actually since the financial crisis that the number of protectionist measures overcomes or is larger than the number of liberalizing measures year by year, right? So protectionism has been on a rise for a while. But what is different now, and so we have seen a stepwise increase in protectionism in late years, but what is really different now is the nature of this protectionism, right? Putting politics at the center and using it as an instrument, using trade policy to achieve political objectives. I think this is what makes the nature of the protectionist policies now different. And yeah, and then we see a key player, the United States, and I think the 2nd of April is actually a step, a historical step, right, backward for the multilateral trade system, because we have, basically a country moving away from multilateralism, and what we had for 80 years, right? Trade grounded by multilateralism, and now, let's say, rolling that backwards. And for Germany, there is a lot at stake here for two main reasons. First, most of the trade flows from Germany, so most of the exports and imports from Germany are under the rules of the World Trade Organization, under the MFN tariffs. This is one aspect. The other aspect, we have been working quite a lot in the late years on global value chains, and we all know that Germany is deeply integrated in global value chains, right? And and Europe plays the major role, but also key players here, the United States and China, are very important for the let's say the organization, the efficiency of German global value chains, and so which are the two countries that are the center of the recent geopolitical conflict. So. So in the competitiveness of the German exports and the competitiveness of German trade rely on access to inputs and rely on access to global markets. And we have at the IFO Institute, we have this monthly business climate index, and what we observe very clearly is that, so we had a recovery in 2021, but since then it's going down. So in the sense that it reveals more pessimistic expectations by firms, with tiny signs of recovery, but not enough to create confidence. And this means that firms are holding back their investments, right? So I think the spending commitments that the new government has announced they have. First of all, this important signal for firms. So to create, let's say, this environment to foster investment. So I think first of all, it has this signaling effect for firms that are facing massive uncertainty. We heard in the beginning that there were over 50 changes in policies in the US. So this means massive uncertainty for firms. And this means that they invest also less. And this also creates, so in terms of, if we look at in terms of firms, this creates also opportunities for firms for investment, not only in terms of industry investment, so in infrastructure, but also if we think of digital infrastructure, of cybersecurity, so the technological aspect that was mentioned before. But the second aspect of these spending commitments are so given the geoeconomic tensions, it also creates or reduces the vulnerabilities that we currently might have, right? So in particular, in key infrastructure, the question is then, we can have then a longer discussion, what is a key what is a critical good? What is a key infrastructure? Right? This is harder to define, but I think there are sectors that are easily defined as critical. But overall, so going back to the importance of these expenditure commitments for the German economy and what it means for the transatlantic relation, I think what the package means in practice will depend a lot on the implementation, how it's going to be implemented, right? Because it needs to come with other reforms. If it doesn't come with reforms on the labor market that increase labor supply, and it doesn't come with reforms in terms of bureaucracy that make these investments also feasible, then we won't gain much in terms of reducing vulnerabilities and increasing security. So I think two points that I would like to emphasize. So one is the importance then of coordination with the EU, because for Germany, the main asset of Germany is being in the EU, right? And having this integrated economy in the EU, and this means also market power. So if you think of geoeconomics, geopolitics, this is a source. The market size is a source of market power, and in this sense, also the strengthening the EU market also means a larger market power in terms of geoeconomic considerations. And yeah, the second is then this need to urgent need to conduct other reforms on the side to make these investments possible, and then to bring back confidence for firms and make these the investments then feasible.
Thanks. So it sounds like so far so good, but maybe some reforms and more Europe, and then maybe we'll really see what happens. Okay. Laura van Daniels, you are responsible for North America, so I think it's fitting that we end on a transatlantic note, and maybe let's try to at least end on a future-oriented note if we can. And if I could ask you, what possibilities do you see for U.S., German, and broader U.S.-EU cooperation on this issue of economic security? For example, towards China, where I think we've seen some increased consensus on the challenge, but also where, of course, do you see risks of conflict on this issue?
Thank you, Peter. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and to participate on this panel is really interesting, because I think by what we've heard already from Lysander and David and Andreas Nicolin's presentations, there is lots of common grounds that we can build on. And your question was on possibilities for cooperation, either US, German, or US, EU cooperation on economic security. So I want to make 3 points on that. First one is very basic about the US-German versus the US-EU relationship. I think it's important for the Trump administration in its approach towards Europe to really bear in mind that cooperation with Germany on trade can really be only a consultation process. Germany, obviously, and Lysander has made that very clear, is a very important economy and political player in Europe, but we have decided a long time ago that the EU is responsible for trade policy, and it should stay that way. And from everything we've heard so far from Friedrich Merz, that seems to be very much the line of the German government, and for good reasons. Second point, economic security goes beyond trade. One might even argue that until recently, trade has not even been considered an area of national security or economic security, right? So national security in the EU rests with the member states. And we don't have an EU-wide national security definition. We have legal workarounds, and it already showed up in your presentation, Andreas Nicolin. We speak of public security, or recently in European Commission documents you find the term security and public order, that then allows EU harmonization of rules. But it's still different from sort of the discussion you have in the US, where national security and economic security as a derivative of that is very obviously in the hands of the federal government. And we don't have such a thing in Europe. But to preserve public security in the EU, the European Commission has come forth with several proposals beginning in January 2024. And there was a proposal on the revision of investment screening, and it's actually been adopted in the first round already in the European Parliament, and has a good chance of passing, I think, even this year in the Parliament and the Council. And it would include mandatory investment really in all of the member states, which is still not the case. Sorry, mandatory investment screening in all of the member states. That would make a difference. And that would relate to investments in media services, critical minerals, transportation, dual-use goods, military technology, and artificial intelligence, and other things. So that would be a huge step forward, I think. Based on the term public security in the EU, obviously there can be a joint implementation on export control regulation, and you've already touched on that as well. At this point, I think we're mainly talking about dual-use goods, but it's already been mentioned that then probably it makes sense to harmonize rules also on all kinds of new or emerging and foundational technologies, which would be going perhaps a bit beyond the dual-use approach, but that then would create, I think, significant overlap with US policy on economic security. Okay, third and final point, I think any US-EU cooperation on economic security really rests on a common idea of what economic security is, or a common definition. And I'm, at this point, 3 months into the Trump administration, not so sure of what that definition is on the US side. But there's something that we could work with very well. I think that's been formulated in the Biden years. I recall the former Deputy Security Advisor, National Security Advisor, Dalip Singh, presenting a one-sentence definition of economic security that was, I think, very helpful. It was broad, but helpful. He defined it as the ability to sustain the sources of long-term economic growth across cycles. That's economic security. And I think that's something we could work very well with on both sides of the Atlantic. So based on that definition, I think there could be more cooperation on export controls. We certainly need an alternative format to what was previously in use and known as the Wassenaar Agreement on dual-use goods. As I said, there could be more further cooperation on new and foundational technologies and export controls on those technologies. And I think there could be an intensified dialogue on security concerns related to EU, but also US investments in China, and the risk of technology transfer that is tied to those investments. And I think why not start from something we already created, the Trade and Technology Council, which is still, at least, it's not been dissolved, right? It's still around. We could use that very well as a forum for further dialogue on security, on economic security concerns, in particular also with regard to investments in China, but perhaps also in other places. And there could be, and that's my final point, there could be, for me at least, it would make sense to at least prepare a dialogue on a coordinated sanctions regime in case of a forceful takeover of Taiwan by the Chinese side. I think there are good lessons to learn from all of the preparations that have been taken by the US and its allies before Russia decided to invade Ukraine, and certainly after that. So cooperation on sanctions has been really a success story, at least mostly. And we could learn from that. And while that might stretch the European Commission's or the member state government's definition of public security, I think you could argue that by creating such a preparation or the foundations of a potential sanctions regime, that serves protecting democracy, freedom rights, and access also to critical technologies, also for us in Europe. So therefore, I think it's a good area of, could be a good area of cooperation. I leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Let me take your remarks as a starting off point for a question both from to you, David, from an American perspective, and then from the Germans on the panel from a German or European perspective. The United States has signed 2 trade deals in the last several days, one with China, one with the UK. If you look at the UK agreement, there is maybe more than a paragraph, a little bit less than a chapter on economic security. There's a commitment to working together on economic security. The text mentions, I remember it does mention investment security. I don't remember it mentions export controls, but it mentions some of these issues that I think we agree are, at least policy measures that we agree you can file under economic security. David, perhaps to you, do you think the United States would be ready to sign a trade deal with the EU that includes economic security issues? And let me just then say what I would like to ask the Germans on the panel, you know, or is, given what you said, Laura, you know, how ready would the EU be to respond and sign up to something with the US on economic security, given this kind of, you know, division of powers you mentioned? I mean, parenthetically, since the beginning of the second von der Leyen Commission, the relevant Directorate General is called the Trade and Economic Security DG. That may just be cosmetic, but it seems to, I would say it also indicates some deeper policy consideration. So, David, what do you think? Would the U.S., would the Trump administration be ready to do something like that with Europe that it did with the EU, what it did with the UK?
I think that's a fundamental thought of this White House is how do you deal, you know, I talked about capitalism with Chinese characteristics. How do you really deal with that? All right, and it does. I once asked our former trade rep a question, you know, how does she think about it? And she wouldn't answer the question. Okay, so I do think it's a transatlantic issue that we have to figure out mutually how we deal with China. Okay, and that's the purpose of the UK provisions, and the Chinese were not happy about it. I do think that when I talked about US GDP, I do think that the American view of Europe is that Brussels needs to be more deregulatory. Okay, when I was in Berlin 2 weeks before the election with a group of American investors testing the zeitgeist of Germany, all we heard from BDI and Mittelstand Stiftungs is that they're crushing regulatory burden out of Brussels. And you know, to me, I think growing, getting the engine of Europe fine-tuned, running, you know, is really what we love to see. Okay, I mean, because that is really what is going to, you know, make every issue so much easier. Same thing in the United States. Growth, we have a tremendous deficit. I mentioned $2 trillion a year. You know what solves that? Economic growth. And so the three legs of the Trump stool is yes, foreign direct investment, lower taxation, and deregulatory environment, you know, and more energy to lower the cost of inflation. So the answer is, I think there's a very realistic lens on China, and I think negotiations with Europe are going to be difficult. Why? Because we know that the farmers in Europe, you know, are very politically active, so to speak. U.S., what do we export? Boeing jets, services, food, right? Not a lot, okay? And so with Europe not being at the table for food, it's much harder to get to an agreement, okay? Ireland's $50 billion trade surplus, that's mostly in pharmaceuticals. That's going to be a challenge for Ireland. Germany's $70 billion surplus, I assume, is mostly autos. I don't know. But again, I think we can all be realistic and understand that, as I said in when I spoke earlier, that, you know, there is so much strength to build on. I mean, we've been doing this for 70 years, and American companies feel very comfortable doing business in Europe, particularly in Germany, and vice versa into the States. So I think, Peter, it's going to be a challenge, because as Henry Kissinger famously said, when you want to talk to Europe, who do you call? But I will leave you with one thought. Again, I said the press misreports what's going on. So during the IMF meeting, I took some people who were in town to the White House for a meeting with the president's economic team. And you go in there, and it's very calm. People's hair's not on fire. It's very rational. But I said on the way out the door, I said to this gentleman, I said, it's going to be hard to get a deal with Europe because Trump's never had a good relationship with the European leader. You know, it didn't really work out really well with Merkel, and of course Olaf Scholz, and he doesn't know Merz. And he says, that's wrong, David. He says that Ursula and Trump speak frequently. And that's not reported. I mean, completely. I mean, you get a different impression. So there is conversations at that level happening, which is a positive. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Andreas, how do you see the issue of economic security in the context of US-EU talks? And if you want to speak more broadly about what a deal would look like, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's not so easy. I mean, there are talks going on a senior official level with respect to technologies. This is what I alluded to before in my introductory remarks. This was an initiative started by the Biden administration. They set up about 6 or 7 workshops, each dealing with one sensitive technology, for example, quantum, artificial intelligence, connected driving is another issue, important issue, and they invited a couple of like-minded partners, many Europeans, then also from East Asia, of course, Japan and Korea. The Commission was not always invited, which we complained about, and but there's some reasonable work going on in this regard. On a more abstract level, of course, well, economic security for the US administration is always a kind of proxy also for China containment policy. In this regard, there are, of course, some differences between the American, the European approach, which is of course a consequence of America being the world power #1, China #2, and the obvious conflict which is arising from that. Whereas Europe is of course also a big political and economic player, but not with any let's say geopolitical ambitions, and this makes our approach to China a bit more relaxed, even if we are of course concerned about the Chinese behavior, about the distortions caused by the Chinese economic model, which are more and more causing concerns for our industrial business companies. So this is obvious, but we have not this tense relationship. We are also not a player in the Pacific region, where both powers are confronted in a very visible manner. If you look at those islands, and Taiwan was mentioned, so it's a bit of a different nature, and in this sense, we sometimes from the European side try to moderate a bit the American approach towards China, but all in all, it's a good discussion with, that has been started at least by the Biden administration. With the Trump administration, the problem is that the discussions are not, they are partially not existent, or if there are any, they are of well, they are not very well organized. On trade policy, the American president obviously loves to have encounters with member states, heads of state and governments, and then afterwards he said he had a great meeting, and we will have a great deal. But on the ground, the European Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, he's very busy in trying to get into contact with Lutnick, for example, and Greer, but he also succeed too, but they do not enter in a real negotiation mode, because obviously there's no mandate for the American representatives, and it seems that the European Union is now at this juncture not the preferred partner for setting up a deal. I mean, in theory, a deal should be possible. The interests are, for both sides, are clear. They are easy to be defined. both in more traditional trade policy, but also in terms of economic security. But then there are those obstacles in getting into real negotiation mode. There is, of course, also another more systematic obstacle, which is that the European Commission, of course, sticks to at least formally, to official free trade agreements which are consistent with WTO rules. So they have to be quite broad and have to cover about 90% of all goods and services and so on. And this is, of course, not what the Trump administration idea of a deal is. And so if we come into negotiation mode, then there will be those systematic difficulties. The Trade Commissioner obviously tries to give some signals that he's ready to overcome those. So he, in his rhetoric, he has adjusted to the Trump administration's philosophy and has offered some deals with respect to LNG, and he also talked of closing the gap, but not in the trade deficit, but in the current account deficit, which is economically the fundamental issue at hand. And so there seems that the Commission is quite keen to get progress, but well, we have to see if now maybe it will be our turn to come into talks with the Americans.
Thanks. Lisandro, how do you see that? Do you think that the basis is there for a U.S.-EU deal on sort of trade and broader things? And do you think that including economic security would facilitate the success or make it harder?
Yeah, a deal. So we have quantified different scenarios of a trade deal between the EU and the US. And because actually, if we look only at tariffs, the tariff gap between the EU and the US is pretty small. So we have looked product by product, what is the tariff gap between the EU and the US? It's on average 0.5 percentage point. So that's not really much, right? And in contrast to what has been a lot in the discussion of unfair trade relations. So the relations are fair in a sense, but of course there are other issues on the table. But so the European Commission came with this offer of putting industrial tariffs to zero, and which was declined by Trump. And I mean, this is not where the US has a comparative advantage. David mentioned before, right? Without accounting for agricultural products, without accounting for services, it's hard to make a deal. And I think that's the hurdle that we currently have, right? So the EU would, if we would go for a trade liberalization, we would also have to have a deal that also accounts for the agricultural sector, that also includes decreasing tariffs in the agriculture in Europe, in the agricultural sector in Europe. And the other aspect is trading services, because so 10% of German exports go to the US. 30% of these exports are in services, and 50% of the imports are in services. So a lot of the trade relations between the EU and the US, and the EU and the US, and Germany and the US are actually in trading services. So I think another aspect is how to make trade more attractive for U.S. firms in the services sector. And David also mentioned before regulations in the EU, and this is a key hurdle for firms investing in the EU. We have also, in another exercise, we have quantified what would be the effect of decreasing regulations within the EU, harmonizing the EU, which would make EU business more attractive for US firms. You enter not only Germany, but you could enter the EU market. So this would make Europe more attractive for US business. And this has large GDP, would lead to large GDP effects. So I think that's on the other aspect, so making our homework in terms of harmonizing regulations within the EU and decreasing bureaucracy for trading services within the EU. This would not only increase GDP, but would also make, let's say, business or Germany and the EU more attractive for US business. But overall, so in our different scenarios, if we look at one scenario where we put tariffs to zero, or at least we put tariffs to the level of the partner. So let's lower our tariffs to the level of the US, and the US lowers the tariffs to the level that currently the EU has. Both countries would gain, right, in these scenarios. Whereas in the scenario of the Liberation Day that we had on the 2nd of April, so these could have costs for the German economy that are up to 0.3% of the GDP. So these are large costs. Right? So I think so finding a deal would definitely be beneficial here, also for both sides, also for the US side. And the question is, so then are there other aspects besides trading industrial goods, so including agricultural goods, including services, and also aspects on security that would make then this deal more attractive? Because, as I mentioned, so these would be beneficial, for both sides.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I mean, there's deregulation, but there's also eliminating barriers in the single market. And I think I saw a figure, reputable figures, not too long ago, that if I remember correctly, it was that the barriers to services trade within the EU are the equivalent of 110% tariff, and on goods was 30%, something, 20, some not as high, but quite significant. So there could be a lot of progress on that end. Laura, let me bring it back to you if you have any further thoughts after what you've heard, since I did get inspired by your own remarks.
Sure. I think there, from what we already know from the US-UK and the beginnings of a US-China deal, and there's some lessons to learn already for the EU. First of all, these agreements, I mean, we haven't seen really much of them yet. It's sort of it's not clear, at least at this point, what exactly is meant by cooperation on China policy in the US-UK agreement. But there's a lesson here, and that's maybe there's something in between a full-blown WTO-compatible transatlantic agreement and no agreement at all, which could be a sort of memorandum of understanding between the US and the EU on general lines of foreign economic policy, on reduction of tariffs and deregulation in certain areas, and have that, and then maybe enter a process again, perhaps relying on existing institutions or quasi-institutions like the Trade and Technology Council to really start the process of working on the details of what a broader transatlantic economic deal or agreement of sorts could look like in the future. Because we all know these things take years. We've not been successful so far under various administrations to secure such a deal. So it's highly unlikely that it will happen now, right? Going beyond mere tariff reductions on industrial products, I think everything going beyond that will be very difficult, so it will take time. But we can still agree on certain things and sort of stop this spiraling out of control trade war. And as we've learned, the assumed costs of the reciprocal tariffs, the way that Trump implemented them or tried to implement them in early April, are sort of equivalent to what we're talking about in the whole domain of defense policy, right? So why would that make sense for the US to impose such costs on the EU at a critical moment in time where you actually want your transatlantic partner to invest much more on the defense side? And we also in Europe, at this point, an agreement, perhaps for the first time in many decades, that this needs to be done. So why stop that by taking away economic gains from Europe? So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Great, thank you. The WTO has been mentioned, and I was actually just in Geneva for a couple of days before coming here, and it does seem to me that there's inside and around the organization there's a pretty acute awareness of the challenges to multilateralism, but also I think an awareness that even for an organization like the WTO, the future is in coalitions of the willing and plurilateralism. So I have a different question, one for you, David, and one for the other panelists. David, for you, we've seen a lot we've seen from the Trump administration we've seen some bilateral engagement. We already have the China and the UK deals, and the administration says there'll be others. How much perspective would there be for a coalition of a willing approach, working with more than one partner on economic security or other issues? And then for the Germans on the panel, how much willingness would there be on the EU side for that kind of G7 plus, let's call it, or other kind of coalition of the willing approach, especially if it did mean that you'd have to do something that wouldn't be consistent with WTO rules, because other considerations like security are just so important that you decide, at some point we may have to do this. So 2 different kinds of questions. Is there a place to meet in the middle?
I'd like to first say that we think that this whole tariff discussion is going to be over by the end of June. Okay, we think the U.S. will strike agreements quickly with India, South Korea, Japan. There'll be some agreements with Canada and Mexico to accelerate USMCA negotiations. Europe, I hate to say, it's a little bit of a black box. I agree. I know that your minister, DG Trade's been in Washington, not really getting what he wants. I think part of the problem is also that EU fines in the digital space, your 2 big digital acts, generally targeted towards American companies, personally annoys the president. Okay, and people that have worked for him the first time have told me that. So, again, we're in a post-Biden era. Okay, let's firmly draw the line under that. And what does that mean? That means I think it's a lot more realpolitik here. All right, I think it's we're having a sort of Kissinger moment versus a Woodrow Wilson moment in American history. So I think you're going to see a continuation of Trump wants to get along with Xi Jinping. Okay, so everything what I'm trying to say, why I'm saying that, is he doesn't. We don't get out of bed. We have to decouple from China. We have to isolate China. That's absolutely not in what people are thinking. Trump has actually said he wants to see the Chinese market more open, is what he said, okay? So that's really his goal. And he actually, believe it or not, unknowns to most people, he had a mechanism during his transition to communicate with Xi Jinping. He had a staff member who, once a week, Trump wrote a note to Xi Jinping. He flew to Washington, went to dinner at the Chinese ambassador's house. They wired it to Beijing, got it back, flew back to Mar-a-Lago the next day. And then Trump called Xi Jinping once. So there isn't this, and I want to just leave that, we're not trying to create a wall around China of economic security. I mean, I think we're trying to create, some balance, okay? I think sometimes, and I think we've heard this for a while, going back, that the United States has been critical of some of Europe's industrial policy vis-a-vis China. Airbus is quick to manufacture in China. Maybe 20 years ago, that was not really looked upon favorably. But it's not, it's not a, we are looking for cooperation and economic security, but we're not trying to build a moat around China. We're not trying to hurt China economically, all right? But we're trying to, again, it's a country with $1 trillion worldwide trade surplus. That's not good for anybody's security, or your GDP.
Andreas, how do you see that sort of opportunity for what I call shorthand kind of, G7 plus cooperation in the current environment on things, on economic security, and if that led to a deal where you had there's a fork in the road and it was multilateral or kind of working with close partners on economic security. I mean, if you got to that point, let's say, unfortunately, what do you think? What do you think? At some point, do you think the German government or the European Commission would be ready to, let's say, at least consider taking either of those roads?
Okay, I think the cooperation within G7, G7 plus, and comparable ad hoc fora on economic security is work in progress. It works quite well. Of course, the disadvantage of these of the outcomes of those configurations is that's always quite abstract. So there are nice declarations and communiques, but what follows from it, and it's of course also a kind of soft policy. So there are no binding obligations to implement something in a certain manner. But nevertheless, it's important because it's a good environment to get the Americans on board, also the Trump administration. You can observe in the current Canadian G7 presidency that the Americans are a bit hesitant with regard to cooperation, because some political issues have happened which are hampering cooperation. But nevertheless, it's a good idea. Then what I mentioned before, this technology-oriented work started by the Biden administration. This is quite good in substance, because it's very focused on certain technologies, and it goes into more technical considerations. The administration in Washington was still the Biden administration, has also issued some concrete regulatory proposals which are being discussed there. So this is quite good. And so a good example is connected driving, the risks which are implied by autonomous cars, which is a technology where the Chinese are quite strong. And so discussion on this level, which are more technical in nature, are really fruitful. Another example is outbound investment screening, which was also put on the table by the US as a domestic regulatory proposal, and which focused the attention of some potential risks in FDI, which maybe are not covered by traditional instruments as export control and so on. So these are very fruitful discussions, I think. On the more systematic issue of compatibility of WTO rules and economic security, I think there is some scope for consistency in the WTO law. There is a exemption clause which refers to security, which is quite general, but I think with some interpretation you can bend it in a direction that it's consistent with economic security. As far as I know, the WTO itself was a bit hesitant to touch the issue. I remember they have issued a report where they have made a critical discussion of economic security, with the bottom line that traditional free trade policy is the best instrument to guarantee economic security. Okay, so there is still some way to go, but I think in principle it should be possible.
Lysander, would you be optimistic that on both the idea of kind of broader than bilateral cooperation, and then this idea that economic security could be consistent with other obligations, particularly as we know the EU, at least at this point, seems very concerned to maintain those obligations.
Yeah, I agree with Andreas. So I think it's crucial to maintain these cooperations and to these discussions. I think it's similar to, if you think of trade policy, diversification is always better, right? An increasing cooperation and increasing diversification, not only for trade, but also for security questions. It goes, I think, a bit hand in hand. But yeah, it's the question how far this can be WTO compatible. This is, I think, for that to need also then discussion with lawyers to discuss how far can we put in on this as a WTO compatible policy. Yeah.
Well, we don't want to have lawyers as part of the discussion right now, of course, but no, just. Laura, maybe before I open up to our audience, you talked about some of these issues in your opening remarks. How do you see that future of if there's a fork in the road in order to make sure that economic security stays central to EU trade policy?
I think the problem with all of that is that these are dynamic games, right? The situation is currently evolving, that it very much will depend on how the US and China relationship will develop, because that has an effect on sort of the political pressure on us in Europe. But maybe that's an easy way out for someone doing research rather than policy, is to say, perhaps we don't know enough yet or haven't studied enough yet the consequences of these trade-offs that we're facing. And when we talk about bending the rules, if we think of, say, implementing anti-subsidies rules or even something as big as anti-coercion vis-a-vis China, right? What would be the short-term, medium, long-term consequences, not only for our bilateral relationship EU-China, but how are other countries looking at us in the WTO? To what extent will that be sort of undermining the WTO for good and contribute to destroying this regime that we've all put so much effort into building and keeping alive for so many years? So before you take big decisions like that, I think what we needed is a better sense of what the consequences are. And then it will depend on how tough, essentially, the fight will get, so to speak, right?
No, I think it's a very good point. A lot of things are in flux, and so maybe it's a better time to be getting ready to make decisions, but maybe not necessarily take those decisions. Yeah, good. I'm looking at our audience here, and I want to offer them opportunities to ask questions. Will we have? Do I just open my ears up, or I don't know if we have a mic, but we have one question coming already from here, and I see a couple of others. Yeah, so please.
Thank you. I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, Tom O'Donnell. I work on energy and international affairs. I'm an ex-Wilson Center. It's not that I left Wilson, it's that it disappeared. It was Doged. So anyways. I remember 2012, Xi Jinping first, well, it wasn't the first time, toured the US just before he was going to become premier. And the message he was giving, he talked to Obama and other people, China had to change its model. They needed to have more internal consumption because of the vulnerabilities. They didn't want the, I used to teach development, right? They didn't want the middle income trap. Perfectly reasonable. It was farsighted. And he also talked about moving up the value chain, not being so dependent on export goes with that, right? not so much more in the services and high-tech stuff, which is more education, so it made sense. So one thing he's obviously doing, but then 2015 I went downstairs to the Brookings Center, downstairs from where you used to be located, and I got my first to meet Wolfgang Schäuble, very interesting fellow. And he gave a talk that was the opposite about Germany, that about exports, and it's just it was completely opposite. And I'm sorry, I'm just listening to what people are saying. There's a paper you wrote recently about diversifying exports. We can't rely so much on China. Your Katharina Reiche, she said the other day, I didn't hear it, an economist told me, we have to find other places to export to, right? So it seems like ideologically, Germany's stuck in the same model. Xi Jinping knew better, but he doesn't want to turn over party control to households, right? But I don't get it in Germany. It's like we have to find another way to keep exporting in this way, but I think you really have to develop the domestic market. That would also make the Americans happy in a way, and it would make Germany less vulnerable. I don't know. Navarro, as far as what Besset and Navarro want, maybe they were kidding around. They said, first thing is we don't want any more barriers to German companies leaving and coming to America. So that'll be a bit of a challenge, I think. But I just like to, outside of Germany, it's a different, I hear the story different, right? It's very, I don't think I'm saying anything radical. Anyone?
I think, yeah, you got it perfectly right. Germany is very much stuck in a perfect world, ideas of a perfect world where we are still the exporting champion globally, and our growth model is very much completely based on that. It's just, and I think you heard Chancellor Merz before he came into office talk about that, and that there is a need for a change, but there's no quick fix to that. And by the way, it's not just Germany. I mean, there are other economies in the European Union that very much follow our lead, or sort of up in line on the same value chain, right? So with similar interests. So I think it's a bit unfair to always just point to the German economic growth model. But yeah, there needs to be change, and the answer much to that, I don't know, Lisanna, you probably wrote about that too, is Europeanization, supporting the European single market. I think you heard this come out of the European Commission prior to the US elections, perhaps already with Trump in mind, that we need to improve our competitiveness, that we need to deepen our financial markets, capital markets union, all of these, they're here, yeah, right? So, and it will need, and I agree, it will need change on the German side, and Germany's voice then in the group of the European Union member states to get to change, but it will take time, I guess.
But I excuse me, but I think where Europe's been talking about integrating capital markets forever, and it's time to get that done. Because I mean, the United States wants to see Europe more competitive, wants to see European GDP grow, okay? And the way that's going to happen is on a continent basis through the community. If you get your capital markets, because Germany is basically underbanked. I always have a joke, if Jeff Bezos went to Deutsche Bank for a loan, would they have given it to him? Of course not, okay? But we have to change that. So we have to, that culture, same thing with securitizing debt, same thing with insolvency laws. The basic foundational foundations of capitalism, still aren't harmonized, as you said, on a continent-wide basis. And I think if Europe gets that done, it's going to give a huge boost to GDP, and it's going to be very positive for the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, I agree. And so Laura also mentioned we are a bit stuck in this, right, in the current model. Indeed, I mean, Germany has a comparative advantage if you look at pharmaceutical industry, machinery, automobile industry. These are key sectors for the German economy. But what we also observe is that we have an increasing share of services in these goods. So we have software, design, this is everything in a car, right? So an increasing amount of services that are attached to the good. And I think that's why it's even more important to deepen the single market, because the single market is liberalized for trading goods. There are no tariffs, everything can move, but if you look at trading services, there are so many barriers, so basically we have 27 different systems inside the EU. And so if you would liberalize, and this is indeed one aspect that we show in one of our studies on using data and a scenario analysis, that by deepening the single market, liberalizing trading services, the industry will benefit enormously because of the synergies between services and goods. And so also the industry in Germany would benefit from that. And this would make, as I mentioned before, would also make the European Union also way more interesting for US business. So I think there are other perspectives. So Germany doesn't need a new model, but it needs to adapt in the sense of taking other dimensions and liberalizing and let's say harmonizing other dimensions within the EU to make also even the industry more competitive. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good point that the Capital Markets Union is long overdue, and since narratives count, maybe the letter reports calling it a savings and investment union, which President von der Leyen has adopted as her own. Maybe that'll help a little bit to get the political momentum.
Now we just need another term for Eurobonds, and maybe there will be
there
a
we go.
future
That'll do it. Jeff, did you have a question? Did you?
I'll defer to
okay,
others.
please. Yeah. Did you?
Okay. Thank you. My name is Caroline Ott. I'm currently studying at the Ludwig Maximilians University here over there, political science and economics. And I have a question that maybe more covers the bigger picture of that whole economic security question. Because, I think the huge importance of transatlantic cooperation and also transatlantic stability is completely out of question. And you have also addressed the maybe risk or the issues that come with China's economic power. But I have a question about maybe the role of the US in that whole question and topic, because we have talked about a transatlantic agreement and what it would take for the EU to agree to that. And I think the interests of the US are clear to have that agreement. But then also regarding, you have mentioned it earlier, the Liberation Day that was in April and the tariffs that were announced, and maybe also if that is, the topic is concluded by the end of June, they still have been announced, and then a day later they have been lowered, they have been paused. I think the reliability of the US since the Trump administration has started is a big topic, and we have seen the US has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, from the Paris Agreement. And my question would be, how can we, in a political sense, trust on the US? How can we be sure that if we have a transatlantic agreement for that economic security, that the US is not going to withdraw at some point or still do tariffs, still do decisions? In my opinion, or from my point of view, Trump's actions often seem very impulsive, maybe unrelatable, not really logical. I'm asking myself, how as Europe, from the Europe point of view, how can we trust that the US will stick to that agreement, and that that the US is not going to become a risk to that economic security?
It's a little bit of a de facto versus de jure question, I guess. I don't know if that, but there's maybe more to it. Anybody like to answer that?
Well, first of all, my first response to your question is, well, the U.S. has been defending Europe and Germany, okay? So I think you've been relying on us successfully, all right, throughout the Cold War and currently today. So I think you know that we're here with Europe, both politically and economically. That's number one. Okay, people are shaking their heads yes or no about that statement, but let's be honest about it. Our defense budget is going to be $1 trillion this year, okay? your defense budget is very small, okay? And that theoretically allows states with smaller defense budgets to have larger social welfare programs. And that's something that's being discussed in the United States, okay? Maybe that's not fair, okay? And so this burden sharing, I think is the technical term in defense, is highly welcomed. And that was the first question Peter asked me. And I think it does help to change the discussion, okay? But it's broader than that. I do agree with you that, and I agree with everyone that, and I'm in the business of interpreting public policy for asset managers generally. And we publish a lot of research. It's read about 150,000 times a year. And it's tough to do. But there is a feeling that the U.S. has, and again, what's the first thing I said? I think, you know, whatever news outlet you're getting your news from, it's probably not giving you accurate reporting on the United States. All right, that's number one. To get the true American feeling, okay? So there's a feeling of, even though our GDP line is you know, pointing straight, you know, pointing up compared to Europe's, as I said earlier, there's a feeling that we have fundamental economic problems that have to be addressed. We cannot sustain a $30 trillion deficit. We cannot sustain $2 trillion a year of structural deficit, okay? And we can't sustain $450 billion trade deficit with China, okay? And neither can Europe sustain, you know, what's becoming a $1 trillion Chinese. So where I agree with you is in the methodology, okay? I can't, you know, I'm old school. I was vice chairman of the board of the Woodrow Wilson Center. And so, you know, I believe in traditional diplomacy, okay? And part of what's the challenge is in the trade area is that Trump has a number of trade advisors, okay? It's usually just the United States Trade Representative. Normally USTR does trade. Here in this case, and maybe the Secretary of Treasury. In this case, we have the Secretary of Commerce. We have Special Rep Peter Navarro. It leads to a lot of confusion. It's since been slimmed down in the last month. And Navarro has now been sidelined. It's a little bit less erratic, less negotiating through TV. But there's a real desire to wrap this up because the United States has a very large tax bill that has to be done probably by August 1st. So they don't want to, they can't do trade and have Congress negotiate a tax bill with Congress. So hopefully we're looking at the trade dispute in the rearview mirror largely by July 4th because this tax bill is going to take all the oxygen that Washington possibly needs. Thank you.
David, can I ask you just a quick follow-up on that? Do you think if the trade stuff is wrapped up by then? I mean, this is very speculative. I concede. So you know, does that mean that would open up space for doing more with Germany, with Europe, or Trump administration will be focused on a lot of other different kinds of issues, domestic or other international? Do you see any implications of that for the transatlantic relationship?
Look, I think it'd be really good if we could get an ambassador nominated for Germany, that would be the first step. All right, so we don't have that done, and we don't have an ambassador I don't think, confirmed to the UK or to Paris yet. I mean, Trump's goal is get the tariffs done, get the tax bill done, and hopefully get the economy growing sufficiently that he does well in the midterm elections. That's the runway right here. Yeah, you know, I mean, you know, I mean, I think that's why this event is so important. It's what I also said earlier, that whether it's, you know, it's really, we really need to keep the transatlantic NGOs, I think, very robust. I think that's super important. And I think we have to reach out, like Germany has not nominated a new ambassador to Washington. The last ambassador was from the Green Party, you know, hardly that effective, in my opinion. So getting a good German ambassador in Washington, I think I've heard a couple of names that you probably have, very important. And then, of course, you know, your organization, the different Stiftungs of the different parties, hugely important. So we have a lot of stability, you know, even if the governments aren't doing a million things. I mean, you know, so the NGOs, the political parties, business exchanges, you know, all of that is super, super important.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Yannick Steinmüller, University of Regensburg. And dear Mr. Metzner, I would like to come back to you, something that you alluded to just a couple of moments ago. The strategic competition between the United States and Europe. And a second part, also the black box that is the current discussions around going back on the tariffs, going back on a normal stance between the US and Europe. I've heard that idea being floated around previously, friendly competition in certain sectors to ensure a more robust economy in those sectors. And I have a two-pronged question on that. First, how can we ensure that this competition remains friendly and is understood as friendly from both sides of the Atlantic, both on the US side and on the German side? And if this could be answered by both sides as well, this would be great. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I didn't mean to allude to a strategic competition because I don't really feel there is one. I look at it as much more cooperative, and maybe we need to harmonize it more, but I do not think there's a strategic competition between Europe and the United States. I actually said earlier in my first remarks, I said we need to champion the values that created our prosperity and not be apologizing about it. And as I said, I'm not a believer in state-owned enterprises, okay? And I don't think a country with state-owned enterprises should probably be in the WTO. That's a whole nother story. Maybe do another conference on that. You know, I've been to China a lot. I created the Kissinger Institute on China in the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So I think, look, there's plenty of cooperation that we do every day. And it's, I'm 100% optimistic. I think you'll see, you know, more German FDI into the United States, okay, particularly in the automobile space. The largest export vehicle outside of the U.S., the exported out is the BMW M-Class out of South Carolina. However, the engine and the transmission are made somewhere else. But so I'm optimistic. I did not want to give that at all. I think, you know, I think with Merz now in the chancellery, he obviously is someone that understands American DNA. I mean, he's worked for an American company. I think that brings a completely different view in. I think the composition of the government here without the Greens changes the conversation across the Atlantic. I think there's an opportunity, I think, Peter, you said it, that we can fix some of the trade imbalances simply by purchasing more LNG, for instance. Germany does not have a long-term contract with the United States in liquefied natural gas. So there's a lot of opportunities. Food will remain a stubborn, hard problem. It won't get resolved. But I sit here. I mean, I see it, you know, as the father, as a father of German-speaking kids. You know, I have to be 100% optimistic. Thank you.
Well, I think on that note, if no other note, I think we can maybe, and all the food for thought, move to the coffee break a couple minutes early. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for this discussion, and thank all of you for being here.